Please be seated. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Executive Board of Wageningen University Research, I'm very happy to welcome you here at this very special occasion. First of all, I welcome our 900 registered online guests and the few, perhaps the happy few, who are sitting in this room. This is indeed a very special occasion. Never have we had such a small physical presence at the opening of the academic year. Maybe never in the history of this university. This is unique. But then the times of today are also unprecedented. We've been hit globally, but also as an institution, by a pandemic that we couldn't have imagined. And I'm very happy to say that we are very proud of the way we've been able to handle this until now. But of course, as time goes on, this is complicated. It's difficult for some of us. It's also difficult to see how long it will last. But the creativity, the energy, and the sense of improvisation of all our staff and our students have been absolutely remarkable. Arthur, in his last few words at the formal opening, will say more about this. When we decided on the theme of this day, nature and agriculture as a continuous balancing act, we had no idea, of course, about this pandemic. In fact, the idea was hatched over 1.5 years ago, as I will explain to you later. And incidentally, now that we have this theme, it turns out to be remarkably appropriate. Because this virus, of course, is also part of nature. It's not necessarily what you think of as nature. I mean, it's the sort of hidden, dangerous, black part of nature, if you want. But it is nature. And the fact that we now face this pandemic also shows how difficult and intricate our relationship is with nature. Now, of course, as all living beings on this planet, we as humans have always interacted with nature for our food, for the way we wanted to live and clothe, and in fact, survive. Every single cell or every living being interacts with its environment, its living and its biological environment. And that's, of course, very logical, and it's the normal way of doing. However, what did happen, of course, is that over time...
Thank you for your attention. We're Extinction Rebellion. We have a little message for you. Ladies and gentlemen, the bird has been ignoring our message for a long while. We have a message, and clear them out. We would like climate action and action on the ecological crisis. We would also like clear involvement for students and staff. These decisions that have to be made are very important. We have been campaigning for over a year to get that.
have, over time, continued to dominate our environment, continued to dominate nature. And certainly, as of the advent of our mastering the use of fossil fuels, the use of all kinds of chemicals, we have not just been using nature for our food and feed and fibers, but we've also done quite possibly also irreparable damage to the natural environment. Now, let me be clear that in the course of evolution, we're not the only species to have global impact. If you think back, and then we're talking about billions of years back, of course, the advent of cyanobacteria that actually made oxygenated Earth possible had quite an impact as well. They changed the living environment in a way that we cannot even imagine. But to stick to our time today, of course, it's in the last decades, perhaps the last half century, that we've become aware of our impact on the environment. And in terms of the impact, apart from the fossil industries, it is land use by agriculture that is the major impact on the Earth and the Earth's surface. And we now arrive at a situation where, on the one hand, the understanding of ecology has also shown us in agriculture that there are things we can do to minimize that impact. In fact, modern agriculture, contrary to what some people think, is far less destructive than other forms, more traditional forms of agriculture, because we have been learning to minimize our impact, to minimize the use of chemicals, to link our breeding program to the environments that animals and plants are living in. So in that sense, of course, we're doing better than we used to perhaps 50 years ago. However, that's not necessarily the perception. What is, I think, unique about today's situation is that the advances of science are not necessarily recognized by society at large. What science has been doing the last few decades is to get a greater control of the production environment, of the plant, of the animal, of water, of the atmosphere. And that has led, in fact, to much higher yields, but also, in a way, to less impact on the environment. Not always, not everywhere, and there's still many parts in the world where this is not the case. But, for example, the CO2 emissions per 100 liters of milk or 1,000 kilos of wheat are among the lowest in the Netherlands in a very highly controlled environment. And the key word here is control. What we have done as human beings and as scientists also is to increase that control over the ecological processes that we were involved in. Yet at the same time, as I said, that's not the perception in society. And I cannot remember, over the many, many years I've been involved in the subject, more polarization, more controversy about agriculture than today. In all kinds of ways that we don't need to go into today, agriculture is seen as, in some ways, an evil force. And the natural environment is seen as beneficial, as even benevolent for human beings. That, of course, is quite unique, because nature or wilderness as a source of fear is not that long ago. It's only a few hundred years ago that the relationship was in a way opposite or reversed. But today, as science, in fact, evolves in one direction, the perception in society is quite opposite. And of course, it is true. And it's thanks to groups even like Extinction Rebellion that we have been forced as scientists, but also as a sector, to think and rethink what we are doing and how we are doing it. So in that sense, I think we stand in a way at a crossroads. Yes, science leads to greater control, and that can actually lead to less land being used for agriculture under ideal circumstances. Of course, markets don't always have those ideal circumstances. And I think that a new way to look at things is through the lenses of what I would call our responsibility to protect the environment, to protect biodiversity, to make sure that the climate impact is turned, where possible, also in a favorable direction. So the tasks, in other words, for the sector of agriculture, or food and agriculture in its widest possible realm, has become even more complex, even more complicated. But it's actually still more difficult than that. And that's why I'm talking about this continuing balancing act. Because what we've seen also with the advent of agriculture, that some species and even some landscapes are actually favored by the fact that agriculture has been there. A very good example is the Hoge Veluwe, the area just to the northeast of here. That kind of landscape, these sand dunes that are partially of post-glacial origin, are also a product of what I would call low-efficiency agriculture. And today we like these landscapes, and we spend a lot of time to prevent the climax vegetation that actually belongs there, i.e. the normal temperate forests, to come back because we like those open spaces. And so our relationship between nature and agriculture is a complicated one. We also want to maintain certain things. We want to maintain certain species. We want to maintain certain landscapes. And that is something that is evolving. Over time, new values have come into being. We have a far stronger, far more numerous, and far more vocal middle class that actually demands more nature and more attention to biodiversity, more local perhaps even in terms of productivity, in terms of food chains. All that will continue to change. It is also changing because of another development, and that is our continuing understanding of what ecosystems are all about. I think of all the sciences that we have to deal with, there are two fields that have grown tremendously. One is genetics, and the other one is ecology. And especially in ecology, understanding how ecosystems work and how agriculture can actually be a positive force and work with ecosystems, I think is something that is still a great challenge. Now, our role is not to provide answers, and certainly not easy solutions. Yes, answers in a more general sense, but we're not a factory of solutions. We are there to discuss options, to show the scientific basis for options, and to also discuss the possible effects of all kinds of options or policy decisions and so on. That is our role. And secondly, our role is to train young people to be critical, to understand what science is about, and to understand that science always operates in an environment that is changing. And so what we need, obviously, is more investment in ecological science-based research, in the widest possible sense of the word. And for me, human beings are very much part of the ecosystem. But what we'll see over time is our relationship with natural systems, or with half-natural systems, such as most of them in the Netherlands, will change. Our feelings will change, our ideas will change, and our needs are changing. We see now with the advent of COVID-19 how much the appreciation of wide open spaces, of greenery, is growing. And our needs will change again, I'm sure. Our feelings about food, our feelings about the agricultural sector will change. But in the end, ladies and gentlemen, this is also an international story. It's not about finding solutions in the Netherlands, not even in Europe. This is very much a story for the whole world. And what we need to aim for, I think, is an optimization of agriculture production to produce there where it is most possible, where it is best in terms of all the negative impacts, and where it's also needed. So moving agriculture production from the Netherlands to another country without taking those dimensions into account, I think would also be a problem. For the time being, for most people in this polarized discussion about nature and agriculture, the key focus is on species and landscapes. And it's therefore a tremendous pleasure for me to announce the real meat of this meeting. As I said, this idea for the theme, a continuous balancing act, was actually hatched 1.5 years ago. And I'm not sure whether our picture is already up. Perhaps we can have it. It was on an excursion in Friesland, in the north of Friesland, to look at the bird that is perhaps the most iconic, the most symbolic of this whole relationship between nature and agriculture and human beings. We were actually there to ring what is called in Dutch the grutto, the black-tailed godwit, a bird that has become a symbol for the Netherlands. But a bird with enormous international ramifications, a bird that lives in very low densities in freedom, a bird that has its complicated relationship with farmers, particularly dairy farmers in the north of the country, but a bird that migrates to Africa with all the consequences that we will see. And the person to speak to you about this is somebody I really appreciate, and somebody who has been closely associated with us. Melchert Meijertz-Lochtern is not just a graduate of Wageningen University. He works with Ruben Smit Productions, and Ruben Smit is actually an ecologist, has a doctorate in ecology also from this university, and together their production company is actually housed on our campus. They're very famous, and you must know them because of two documentaries that they have made before. One is The New Wilderness, about the Oostvaardersplassen, and one is called Wat being the mudflats in the north, just south of the Northern Islands. Their documentaries, for me, are tremendously useful and enjoyable, and absolutely gorgeous. But they're particularly useful because they're science-based, because they're unsentimental, and they're really about how nature works. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Melchert to come forward and give us his preview. And nobody has ever seen this, nobody, not even me, of three scenes from the movie. I'm very most grateful that we get this, shall I say, sneak preview from you. Thank you. Please join me in a warm applause.
Thank you, Louise, for your kind words, and welcome everybody. When I was a young boy, I used to play with a friend of mine who was living on a dairy farm. It was in a small village situated in the province of Friesland. We would play in the fields, and in springtime we collected the eggs of the lapwing. We gingen kievitseieren zoeken in het Nederlands. And during lunchtime, we ate them. Collecting the first clutch of meadowbirds used to be a cultural heritage in the Netherlands, but it no longer exists. This was in the 70s and 80s. Meadowbirds like lapwings, black-tailed godwits, redshanks, tureluur in het Nederlands, were common back then. Since that time, the Dutch godwit population, as you can see, has been decreasing with 5% per year. Nowadays, the godwit population numbers less than 30,000 pairs. And the decline continues. If anything, it's going faster than ever. It's the same figure for the other meadowbirds. It's basically a story of how our agricultural landscapes have changed. I'm a filmmaker. I tell stories. The black-tailed godwit tells a story. In 2019 and 2020, we filmed the story of this beautiful bird. In the Netherlands, we love the bird. It's also our national bird. It's our icon of the Dutch farming system. We even call it a king, the king of the meadows. But what is this king telling us? We filmed in different countries and different farms. We wanted to capture not only the story of the godwit here in the Netherlands, but also on its migration route to Western Africa. We found out that our love for the bird is a cultural thing. I've been in places where they would rather like to kill the bird. The black-tailed godwit has not always been a meadow bird. Godwits existed before people invented agriculture. They lived in the Netherlands before we came here. At that time, much of our landscape consisted of raised bogs and mires and other peatlands, as you can see on this picture. I wanted to see what the primal godwits look like in their natural habitat. So I had to go elsewhere. I had to go to Estonia. This spring I filmed godwits in the raised bogs and fens. It was there that I saw for the first time a godwit alarming in the top of a tree. It was so nice to hear the familiar sound in a totally different environment, in a totally different ecosystem. But the funniest thing was that also other meadow birds like the lapwing, the redshank, but also the skylark, that's the veldleeuwerik, were present in these habitats. They breed in small numbers and low densities, but their behavior is the same. Let's have a look at the primal godwits in the bogs of Estonia. Typical inhabitants around the ponds are the goldeneye, the brilduiker, as well as the wood sandpiper, the bosruiter. And this is our lapwing, onze kiwi. And the sound you hear and the bird you see is the wimbrel, Nederlands de regenwulp. It's the smaller family member of our meadowbird, the curlew, the wulp. And here you can see the redshank, the tureluur. It's also one of our meadowbirds breeding in the peatlands. If you see how fast, wet and open these bogs are, you can imagine that the bird feels comfortable in our open agricultural landscape. Recent research in Estonia has revealed that in these natural habitats, the food availability, basically insects and earthworms, are much slower than in our agricultural system. Originally, farming in the Netherlands kept the landscapes open and wet and resulted in more food for adults and chicks. This explains why godwits in the Netherlands were able to adapt and benefit when peatlands were gradually transformed into agricultural grasslands. Somewhere in the 1950s, the last godwit was seen breeding in a Dutch bog. Around the same time, the godwit population size peaked with an estimated 120,000 pairs in the 1960s. We had the highest numbers of black-tailed godwits in the world, and we still have, although not for long if the current trends continue. Although the bird spends most of its time abroad, it is here in the Netherlands that it's breeding and raise their young. Let's see what the difficulties are from the perspective of the bird. Day 1 in the life of a young godwit. Godwits lay most of the times 4 eggs. They are a precocial species, nest fleeters. Once all eggs are hatched, they move away from the nest. Chicks of the godwits have to find food for themselves. They are not fed by their parents. Common buzzards, the buzzard, were rare in the 1960s, but are common now in agricultural landscapes. Some of them are specialized in chicks of meadow birds. Ladies and gentlemen, we are losing our king, the king of the meadows. 9 out of 10 chicks die before they can even fly. And last week it became clear that the mortality rate this year was worse than ever. The fight for the survival of the godwit has to be won here in the Netherlands. Our economic system triggers farmers to have larger farms and bigger machines and more cattle. This makes it more difficult for them to take care of the meadow birds on their farms. And on top of that, the climate is changing. 1 year ago, I was filming in Senegal. It was in a small village called Finchok, a place where they hate our bird. It is situated in the Senegal along the river Casamance. Small-scale farmers grow rice on the transition zone between the mangroves and the forest with the villages. Every year, the rainy season starts more or less on the same day. I arrived shortly before the rains came. The godwits were foraging on the mudflats of the mangroves, but they like rice better. Once it started raining, it came down seriously. It was interesting to see that the godwits immediately flew to the rice fields. They know that the farmers will start plowing once the rain comes. In this village, it is the women who do the heavy field work. They grow just enough rice for their family. If the yield is poor, they are dependent on food aid. The system is becoming increasingly fragile because the raining season is starting later and is becoming less predictable. Because of the diminishing amounts of fresh water, salination is steadily reducing the quality of the fields. This lowers the yields. And on top of that, flocks of godwits eat the rice after the women have sowed it. As we speak, the godwits are in West Africa. They're in Mauritania, Senegal, Guinea-Bissau. Let me take you to Senegal. When the rain has filled the rice fields, the farmers will start plowing and sowing. In the afternoon, when the women go to the village, the godwits go immediately to the fields. The women were very angry with the birds. They asked us to keep the birds in our country. Why do we release them every year? Luckily for the birds, arms and rifles are not allowed in the south of Senegal. That's why they are not hunted. But the most shocking thing the women told us is that they wanted to use poison to get rid of them. All this filming results in a documentary that shows that the black-tailed godwit has adapted to different kinds of agricultural systems. We also witnessed that the environment is changing rapidly. Our agricultural system in the Netherlands has changed, but also along the migration route, for instance in Portugal and Spain, and in Senegal too, where the bird spends almost 6 months a year. The black-tailed godwit is a master of adaptation. The same bird is being loved and called the king in one place, while it is hated and called a pest in another place. We saw farmers struggling to survive, and we saw the bird struggling to survive. It is difficult to adapt when things change so rapidly. Nowadays, agricultural landscapes are shaped more by socio-economic drivers, rather than environmental and ecological conditions. Changes occur at an ever-increasing rate. The godwits can't keep up and are disappearing rapidly. For the godwits, it would be better if our use of the landscape is more strongly determined by the local environmental conditions. I want to end with a question. If we shape our farming systems to make better use of ecological processes, what would that farming system look like? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, not only for that last soul-searching question, but also for the stunning footage. And you really demonstrated how this iconic bird is, in fact, also the embodiment of all the conflicts and all the difficulties that we have. So please accept a small token of our appreciation, the book that you may want to use and read. Thank you so much.
Thank you
and
very
we
much.
look forward to the final cut of the movie.
Yeah.
When will the documentary be out?
Probably the end of 2021 or maybe in the spring 2022.
Okay.
We
so
need one more season to film.
Good. No,
Yeah.
Good to know this, and we'll all be on the lookout for this. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, there is another enormous pleasure that I have, and that is to announce our artist of today, Lavinia Meyer. She is a world famous, and I really don't say this lightly, a world famous harpist. She's also somebody who has been associated with Wageningen, and in fact with the theme of today, because her music is also part of the movie Mudflats. And so she's known for her understanding of these issues, her understanding of how also music can strengthen the importance of images. And you have already noticed some of the beautiful music in today's sections that you saw. Lavinia is going to be with us here also because she grew up in Wageningen and close to Wageningen, and she's really been associated with the thinking in Wageningen for a long, long time. We've known you, we've known your work, and you are absolutely on my top list of musicians. And not only that, she's going to play my favorite contemporary composer, not a coincidence, you would say, Philip Glass. And she will play two pieces, one after the other. One is Koyaanisqatsi from the eponymous film, and the other one is Metamorphosis 2 from Philip Glass. So Lavinia, please, you have the floor with your beautiful harp. And ladies and gentlemen, a very, very warm and strong applause to Lavinia. Thank you. Thank you so much, Lavinia. This really, again, brings home how important music and art are, not just in general, but really also in these times. You bring us hope, you bring us peace, you bring us ways to think and ponder about all our subjects. So let me try at a 1.5 meter distance to bring you these flowers as a token of our friendship and our thanks for this beautiful, beautiful music. And of course, you all know she is world famous. She has lots of CDs to her name, so please listen to her more than just today. Thank you so much, Lavinia. Now, as you know, it's our tradition at these occasions at Wageningen to also ask 2 or 3 of our young scientists to reflect upon the theme of the day. And we're very, very pleased to have found 2 young scientists who actually are not Dutch to talk about a subject which by some of you may be seen as a typically Dutch subject. Of course, the black-tailed godwit, as we saw, is not a Dutch animal, and nor is, of course, the whole idea of the balance between nature and agriculture. So I'm very proud to announce 2 of our young scientists. Raimon Ripoll Bosch, who is from Barcelona, did his master's degree at Lleida, is an agriculture engineer, and now works in the animal sciences group just on this very relationship between agriculture and nature. And he will talk to you about the research he's going to do and is doing already as a postdoc in our institution. And the second speaker is Ali Al-Akim, who is from Egypt, from Cairo, also an agriculture engineer, but has an MSc in organic agriculture from our institution. So in fact, you are also one of our alumni. He works in the plant sciences group on cover crops and diversity, and you will see both these subjects have really an important bearing on the subject at hand. So please, gentlemen, if I may ask you to come and join me here. We're going to do this ritual dance of who stands where and who walks up. So we'll start with Raimon and then Ali.
Okay. Okay, thank you for these kind words. Good afternoon, everybody. To the ones present here, but also, especially this year, to the ones watching online. If you look at the title of my presentation, well, you might think that there is a typo. I have a green S there, highlighting. But there is not a typo. With my presentation today, I would really like to emphasize the need for balancing acts, plural, in contrast to a single balancing act. Let's start. Nature and agriculture have a complicated relationship. Nature is deteriorating worldwide, and agriculture is considered to be one of the main drivers of such deterioration. However, agriculture is largely dependent on nature. This relationship is usually well explained or well captured by the case of pollinators. Pollinators are essential, are key to sustain food production. However, more intensified forms of agriculture are threatening these pollinators, along with many other species. Our current aim is to develop an agriculture that is able to produce sufficient food, while meantime also conserving and even enhancing biodiversity. However, the issue of the loss of biodiversity, it's not only talking about the loss of species. We can also be talking about the loss of ecosystems and habitats. We can also be talking about the loss of genes and breeds that can ultimately threaten food production. We can also be talking, therefore, about the problem of the scales, from genes to fields, to farms, to regions, and to global level, including trade. We also talk about lack of knowledge and uncertainty. Lack of knowledge about biodiversity in itself, but also in relation to human actions, and also about challenges in assessment and monitoring. We also talk about challenges in policy, how to set effective targets, effective measure, and effective compensation schemes. And we are also talking, as we have already seen, about divergent opinions or contrasting points of view, what we also call different worldviews. Lots of examples here, but perhaps I can illustrate that with the contrasting views between conservationists and farmers, or urban and rural population with regards to biodiversity, and the reintroduction of large predators in rural areas. When we're dealing with complex issues, we usually face divergent opinions, and we usually face trade-offs. And I would like to illustrate that also with a piece of work that we recently did and published. We search for different opinions from experts in the Netherlands on how to conserve biodiversity in the Netherlands. And then we imagine what would that mean for food production. So pretty much going in the direction of trying to answer the question that Melger just posed a few minutes ago. The views were rather contrasting. First, and on the one hand, we had an opinion that we should focus on an emblematic species, the black-tailed godwit. And now, well, thanks to Melger, we all know about the importance of the bird, and it's also rather difficult life. Because it's focusing on conserving one single species, we call that a targeted approach. Another opinion was that focusing on single species might not be enough to conserve biodiversity, that we should be more ambitious and have a wider view to conserve biodiversity. That we called a generic approach. And then we asked to ourselves, if we would implement one or the other, what would that mean for food production? Or what would that mean, in this case, for the Dutch dairy sector as a case study? Well, what we see is that the current situation, or the baseline situation, would yield us with the highest food production, but also the highest damage to biodiversity. Implementing a targeted scenario would improve slightly biodiversity at the expense of about 3% of the food production. Going for a generic scenario, it's, well, has the largest benefits for biodiversity, but at the expense of about 2/3 of food production. And you might wonder, have we found a balance between nature and agriculture? I'm afraid not. 3 observations here. The first one, this is just a theoretical case study. Quite straightforward if you want. Implementing this into reality would be way more complex. First, we should decide where do we want to be in this line. And then we should decide how are we going to do it, and eventually think about a complete redesign of the food system. The other observation is that this is talking about one specific location in the world and one specific sector. The diversity of environmental and also socioeconomic contexts in the world tell me that we will need a range of solutions suited and tailored to every context. And the third observation is that it's not only a balancing act between nature and agriculture, but also on worldviews. While the issue of biodiversity has been largely on the domain of environmental sciences, I believe, and my colleague Ali will continue to address in shortly, that it should be integrated with plant and animal sciences, but also with social sciences, because ultimately we are dealing with governance and with people. And I'm well aware that Wageningen University and Research is starting a platform dialogue to talk about the issue. And it's great, because I really believe that we need further integration in disciplines. But I would also like to encourage Wageningen University and Research to make this platform extensive to stakeholders outside Wageningen University. Just to finalize, I think that we will not need to perform a single balancing act between nature and agriculture, but several balancing acts suited to every context and also sensitive to the different worldviews. Thank you.
Thanks. Good afternoon, everybody. It's my honor to be here today to present to you. Today I'm going to talk about diversity in agriculture and the title of my talk is Diversifying Agriculture in Time and Space, Clever Cover Crops. This is actually also the title of my PhD project, led by Alice Hofland. So if we think about plants, we can find two contrasting systems, agriculture and nature. Agriculture is very important because it provides essential products like food, feed, fiber, and fuel, and it's also a source of livelihood for many people. However, agriculture is a single species-driven system, usually grown as monocultures, which result in reduction in diversity. And such a low diverse system is heavily dependent on external inputs. In the current form, agriculture requires ways of management rather than being self-sustained. Therefore, there is a need of change to a system with less inputs. On the other hand, nature is species-rich, self-sustained, and resilient. So our challenge is how to bring these elements to our agriculture system to be more ecological. So we can ask how to increase diversity in agriculture. We can do that in both time and space, temporal and spatial diversity. So temporal diversity can be obtained by crop rotation. So instead of growing same species repeatedly, we can grow a series of crop across a sequence of growing seasons. Being Egyptian, I have to say that this is an ancient agricultural practice, as my ancestors were already aware of its advantages thousands of years ago. We can also induce diversity by growing more than one species in the same time, in the same field, which is known as intercropping. Intercropping shown outstanding advantages with approximately 30% increase in land use efficiency, water use efficiency, fertilizer use efficiency, and fewer pests, disease, and weeds. So we may ask, if intercropping is so fantastic, why we don't see intercrops all over Western Europe and North America? And the shortest answer will be mechanization. Our current machinery are designed for large-scale monocultures, so they are not suitable for intercrops. We can use wider strips. In this case, we can overcome the mechanization problem. But with less intense mixing, we will lose the ecological advantages. Therefore, research is currently trying to find how wide these strips need to be to achieve a proper balance between practical implications and ecological advantages. There is another way to induce diversity in our system. Perhaps you have noticed this fallow period in our crop rotation. Here we can grow winter cover crops to provide a wide range of ecosystem services. Cover crops are grown to accumulate biomass that eventually will be incorporated into the soil to build up the soil organic matter, to capture also the nutrients from the soil and to suppress weeds. The novelty of our project that we induced spatial diversity in cover crops by growing mixtures instead of pure stands. There are three elements that define why mixing species can be beneficial. First, complementarity. So by growing different species with different rooting pattern, they may capture more nutrients and accumulate higher biomass. Two is compensation. So if one species fails to grow, the other species will compensate and fill in the gaps. Three is facilitation, for instance, by growing a legume species that fix nitrogen to the companion species that benefit them. So together with other colleagues, Rima Bora and Siska Drost, we investigated a whole range of aspects that can be influenced by growing cover crop mixtures. We looked at resources capture and resources use efficiency and the implication on productivity and yield stability. We also looked at litter quality and nitrogen cycling in the soil and the implication on soil organic matter and nitrogen leaching. We also looked at microbial functioning and microbial diversity and the implication on greenhouse gases emissions. So what we found that as compared to pure stands, cover crop mixture ensured the highest attainable yield increased the capture of nitrogen from the soil. Actually, 10% more nitrogen were captured by mixtures, and increased the uniformity of the yield across the field. That's due to the compensation mechanism. Also, mixtures reduce the leaching due to the higher biomass accumulation and enhance the soil organic matter. Mixtures also increase the microbial functional diversity and allows for higher biomass inputs in the soil without any increase in the greenhouse gas emission. So at the end, as a take-home message, I would like to say that we need both diversity and new clever innovations to ensure the sustainability of our agricultural system. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Shukran jazilan, muchas gracias. I'm really pleased to have heard both of you. And before you go, let me say that you both demonstrated in such an eloquent way how important it is to be interdisciplinary, to be innovation-driven, and also to be sensitive to the socioeconomic environment. That's really the dimension we need, and we wish you a lot of success in the pursuit of your studies and your research. So as a token of our appreciation, let me give each of you a book. Thank you. Ramon. Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure to listen to you. So, ladies and gentlemen, we've nearly come to the end of our day. Of course, there's still the most important formal act by the rector. But let me say that for me, the bottom line on this issue is indeed that there is no blueprint, that the relationship between agriculture and nature will vary according to the spatial and temporal dimensions, according to societal wishes, according to what is possible. But most importantly, it will be our task to look at innovation, to look at new ideas, new understanding, new science that can bring to bear something on this very important subject. And I still hope that in some way, not just in the Netherlands, but elsewhere, we can implement some form of land use planning so that both the sharing of land between agricultural systems and biodiversity, but also the separation of nature from the agriculture can be implemented in the best possible way possible. And that's not going to be easy. It perhaps asks for some kind of land use planning, een ecologische en agrarische hoofdstructuur, as we say in our unforgettable Dutch. But let's work on this. This is very much also the theme of our university, of all of us. Now, having said that, COVID-19, of course, has changed a lot of things. It has not changed everything, but it has brought to bear on us more than before the need to think about our agriculture sector, think about universities, to think about the future, the kinds of people we want to educate and train, the kinds of research that is really important. And I'm very pleased that we have several working groups in this institution to work on the future world, WUR, after the curve. So now the floor is to our rector, who will do the very formal opening of this year. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise, for that, and also for organizing this great afternoon, although it was very different from what we used to be. I think before we can open, ladies and gentlemen, the new academic year, it really is necessary to look shortly back on what we have seen for especially the last part of the last academic year. As an academic institution, we have studied a lot and talked a lot about disruptions. And we even had an opening of the academic year, or Dies Natalis, I'm not sure anymore, on disruptions. But being in one and experiencing a disruption is really something different. I would almost paraphrase Monty Python. We have seen that being in a disruption is not easy. And it was quite disruptive, what we experienced from 13 March onwards, what happened with our institutions. But we also saw in that disruptive system of academia, of education, of research, for all kinds of supporting activity, of value creation, we saw that our organization is quite flexible. Our organization is quite adaptive in adapting to new situations. And our organization is quite robust. So while we saw a lot of changes happening in really a fortnight almost, we saw also a large degree of continuity in our organization. We saw continuity in education. So more than 96% of all our courses continued, although in a different mode. We saw a large degree of continuity in research. Almost every research project continued, sometimes in a different way, with different methods, but also a lot of time with great inventivity in a similar way. We also saw all our exams for students continuing, now remote proctored, as we say it today, so also from a distance, with new modes, but also it meant that there was a large continuity for our students. And even on some aspect, we saw an increase rather than a decrease or stagnation. So in the amount of MOOCs, the massive open online courses, we saw that we passed the threshold of 1 million participants in our MOOCs. And that was really an almost exponential increase on where we were in March with the participants. And that's a major achievement. So as an executive board, and I think I also speak here on behalf of the manager directors, and maybe also on the supervisory board, we have to say that we are extremely proud of our organization, of our staff, teachers, lecturers, researchers, supporting staff. You made that we had this, in a disruptive moment, this large continuity of all our activities. So thank you. On the whole of our hearts, thank you very much for what you did. So where are we up to now in the start of the new academic year, 2020-2021? We know we still face a large and huge uncertainty. We know that we are entering a season which is not very favorable of combating the virus, which cause all this disruptive. But we also have the certainty that we have an organization which is so robust, which is so flexible, which is so committed also to its primary tasks: research, education, value creation. So that means that also in this new coming year, we can move a little bit away from only remote ways of doing our primary task. So every student will spend at least 2 half days a week on campus having face-to-face education. And I think that's a major improvement. We also have, although still to a very limited extent, interactions between researchers and other staff members. And of course, we try to continue our support from the executive board, from the managing directors and others for these primary activities as good as we can. I think it was Winston Churchill who said after the Second World War, never waste a good crisis. And I think that's also what we have to do in the coming half year. Although we don't know whether the crisis is really that good, we can also look in what kind of new things have we experienced in the past half year. How did we cope with this crisis, and what kind of lessons can we learn from that? Lessons in terms of different ways of education, lessons in terms of different working modes, maybe a little bit more remote, lessons in terms of our traveling behavior, maybe a little less flying behavior, and becoming a little bit more sustainable. And also lessons in terms of how can we best support the primary processes: education, research, and value creation. And more than ever, I think in this new academic year, we will have to work together. And of course, that was already very strong in our strategic plan, and that's once more and even more in the current situation. We have to work together responsibly towards each other and towards the wider society. And I think that's the main way we have to move in the coming academic year, 2020-21, which I now declare open. Thank you very much for your time being with us, also remotely from home or wherever you are. And I hope that we have a very good, be it different, academic year. Thank you very much.